And it's almost as though we timed this in an unfortunate way. One only has to turn on the news this morning and over the last 48 hours to see that this is a huge issue, and an issue which is becoming more and more stark, and an issue which is ratcheting up to the top of not just the political spectrum, but the spectrum which is impacting systems globally. And that's an issue I think that we will return to later on today. I should say, why am I standing here rather than anybody else? I'm on the board of the Met Office for the UK Met Office. I'm not an expert at all at anything to do with weather forecasting or meteorology. My background is in the world of defence, resilience, national security, but I have a deep interest in understanding resilient systems and what are the interactions with resilient systems to help make them more actively resilient. And so I'll be chairing the event this morning. As I say, I'm not the expert. The experts will be talking to you fairly shortly. So just a couple of housekeeping points, if I may, before I start. Catering will be available after the discussion. Please do stay around, and there'll be a talk for those obviously who are here, and apologies for those on camera who won't be able to join us for that. I think you'll all have found the facilities downstairs. We're not expecting any fire alarms this morning, so if there is a fire alarm, then it's the real thing. So at this point, I'm going to just quickly say what we mean by climate resilience this morning to try and focus the discussion a little bit, and then I'll hand over to our three speakers this morning. So we're defining for this morning climate resilience as the capacity of social, economic, and ecosystems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance. The key focus is how we reduce the vulnerability of society to climate events at all scales. And I think one of the things we will return to again later on this morning is that whole scale issue. This impacts society at all levels. It impacts the individual right the way through to the globals and everything in between. It, from my perspective, has a lot of internal loops that sit within that. There are a lot of loops in terms of different timescales that don't necessarily match in terms of planning about how we do things, both on a short-term and a decadal basis. What that means in terms of investment, what that means in terms of resource. That sort of complexity, the complex systems that sit behind this, are some of the areas I'd like us to start to tease open this morning. It is not just about science and technology interactions and interventions, clearly. The behavioural and social side and social dynamic to this is at least as important in finding solutions to take us through the challenges that we face at the moment. So I'm going to pass over, if I may, to our first speaker. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Ellie Mercer. Ellie is a UK climate adaptation lead at the British Red Cross. She identifies where the British Red Cross can most add value by supporting communities to anticipate, prepare for, respond to and recover from the impacts of climate, including developing partnership with key stakeholders. So Ellie, over to you.
Very much. Okay, is that okay with the microphone? Yeah, everyone hear me in the room? Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Off to a good start. Could you Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks very much. And thanks for your patience, both in person and online. So yes, nice to be with you all today. And I'm here from the British Red Cross, responding to the prompt discussion question that was provided, which is how can societies in the UK become more climate resilient? So you might wonder, why is the British Red Cross involved in discussions on this topic? And if I can move the slide on, I'd be able to tell you that. Perfect. So one of our main reasons as an organisation is to protect people before, during and after emergencies. And what we're seeing is increasingly the emergencies that we're responding to are weather and climate related. So for example, since 2020, our emergency response teams have provided support to over 160 weather and climate related incidences. And we realise that climate change is just going to add increasing demand for our services, and we need to be prepared. But there's also opportunity for us to work with the wider emergency response sector, as well as climate change professionals, to develop tailored solutions for local needs at the community level. Because unfortunately, that need is quite great. So in response to the prompt about how to make the climate resilience of societies, sorry, having a wee bit of trouble moving the slide. There, perfect, just a wee bit slow there. The current situation is, and I would argue, is that the UK is not very climate resilient. We've seen this through our work responding to a myriad of different weather and climate-related incidences, from flood, heat waves, extreme storms. And we're also seeing this in our media coverage daily, as Jordan said at the very start. And what we're seeing is incidences that are easily preventable, from injury, illness, to even in some cases, loss of life. And this lack of preparedness has been unequivocally stated by the UK's own Committee on Climate Change, which just a few months ago came out with a report that said the UK is strikingly unprepared for the impacts of the climate crisis. And this is also demonstrated through the UK's climate change risk assessment, the most recent one being CCRA3. So I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with this. But I just want to stress that of the 61 climate change risks that we've identified for the UK, only 7 of them are currently being taken action of by the UK government. And that's my first point that I'd like to make of how we are to improve the climate resilience of societies across the UK, is to increase but also enhance the way we assess climate change risks. Now, we're very privileged in the UK that we have this wealth of the climate change risk assessment enshrined in law by the Climate Change Act 2008 and supported by the CCC. But I would argue that it focuses too heavily on quantitative information and academic voices, when there's a lot of narratives from communities that could be communicated and contribute to this vast research. Similarly, the focus to date has mostly been on single hazards, and we're increasingly seeing the risk of compound and cascading incidences. And I really welcomed the research that was done by WSP as part of CCRA3 that looked at the interaction of risks for infrastructure. But what we'd like to see is a more social science lens to that. What are the cascading and compounding effects on citizens, on vulnerable groups, bridging together both the physical and social sciences? And indeed, we've been trying to do a little bit of that ourselves by undertaking a strategic climate change risk assessment for the British Red Cross Crisis and Emergency Response Service and the people and places we support. So what I've been doing over the past few months is traveling across the country and speaking with our staff and our volunteers and asking them, how have you been affected by weather and climate impacts to date? And what is your perception of how that risk is going to evolve in the future? But again, we've been interested not only in exposure and the physical hazard, but also looking at social vulnerability. What has been the root drivers of the procedural and distributive and systemic injustices that have played out to influence that climate change risk? And what we've seen, again, through lots of these conversations, is there is a challenge and a need to strengthen awareness and attitudes towards climate change and climate change adaptation. So I've been quite surprised in this new role within this emergency response sector, in that responding to emergencies is very popular, preventing them largely isn't. So there's a huge challenge we have here to not only raise awareness of climate change and its consequences, but importantly to tailor that information to local risks, local priorities, local values, and also in a way that relates to their social identity. And this has been supported by research that we've done looking at the perception and awareness of both flood and heatwave risk across the UK. Last year, we came up with a report called Every Time It Rains that looked at flood disadvantage across the UK. And through national polling, it revealed that only a quarter of UK adults that are living in high flood risk areas say that they have a good understanding of the current flood risk that they're experiencing. This is very similar to what we found in our heatwave research. In 2021, we did a study called Feeling the Heat that looked at national perceptions of heat waves. We actually just redid this study last month, June 2023, and so the new data is coming out in a week or two. But what we found in 2021 was that largely the UK population underestimates the risks of heat waves. And indeed, over half of those aged 75 plus, who often fall in the category of being vulnerable to extreme heat, do not see themselves as vulnerable. So there's a huge awareness and perception challenge that we need to tackle. And one way in which we're doing this is through our work through the community education programme of the Red Cross. And I'd just like to flag a recent toolkit that we just launched last month, which is called Weather Together. And it's aimed at 10 to 16-year-olds and teachers. And it goes through the topics of floods, heat waves, and eco-anxiety, which again is an increasing issue which we need to tackle in order to adapt in a positive manner. Perfect. And then the third point that I'd like to argue, unsurprisingly, for what we need to enhance the resilience of societies across the UK is action. Now, I don't mean to be glib, but unfortunately, there's been little of it to date, and that's why I really want to stress this. I think from our perspective, there's largely been a lot of rhetoric, a lot of words on pages, but practical implementation here in the domestic context in the UK is incredibly lacking. And what has been done has largely focused on physical systems and infrastructure with less acknowledgement of that social and protection element that is so sorely needed. I'd also like to stress that we need to consider both mitigation and adaptation together. And again, we're trying to do this within our own practices. But one of the challenges is that we've found is that we want to take action to not only increase the adaptive capacity of communities and households, but to do that, we need to recognise and overcome the barriers that they face, through from the information gap that I mentioned, through to finance and resource, and also larger market barriers to adaptation. So I just wanted to highlight some research that we undertook with the London School of Economics and the Place-Based Climate Action Network earlier this year that looked at the 2022 heatwave, and identified some of the barriers that were faced in not only responding, but preparing for heat waves in England in the future. And there's a myriad listed here. Again, some are incredibly unsurprising in terms of the huge dearth between the funding and capacity that is needed and that's available, but also this lack of coordination. There's lots of disparate actors, siloed working and competing priorities that we need to create the governance structures to take collaborative action collectively. And that's what we're hoping to do through the British Red Cross. So my role, I've just been there less than a year, and we are trying to complement our strong work in emergency response to also be more involved in preparedness and adaptation action. And we're doing this through progressing activities across 5 adaptation action areas, ranging from data and insight to make sure we have the insight to make evidence-based decisions. People and skills, we have a vast number of staff and volunteers, and we're currently trying to understand their knowledge and understanding of climate change and how their skills and capabilities from the emergency response world can be applied to adaptation actions. We're looking at innovative financing and resourcing, using our research to advocate for both policy and regulatory changes, and engaging with collaboration and partnership. So that's my fourth final argument that I would like to point out for the prompt question of what do we need to make societies in the UK climate resilient, and I would say that's accountability, because to date there's been very, very little of it. And by accountability, I mean all actors playing their part, from national to local government, public and private sector, but in a way that they are held account. There is action owners, there is appropriate resourcing, there's monitoring, evaluation and learning, because what we're seeing is, as I said, this disparate activities across the public, private and third sector that I fear could lead to maladaptation if we are not collecting our learnings and taking a systemic approach to address some of these core issues that are challenging climate risk, but also importantly, climate disadvantage. So in conclusion, from my perspective, to enhance climate resilience of societies across the UK, we need to improve and further our approaches across the assessment of both climate risk and progress on adaptation, the awareness and attitudes of climate change and climate change adaptation, actual action on the ground, and accountability of all actors involved. So what we're hoping to enhance our work in this space, and we would really welcome the opportunity to both learn with and collaborate with others, both in the room and online. And please do reach out if you'd like to learn more. I look forward to speaking with you, and I'll hand over back to Jordan now. Thanks.
Super, Jenny. We'll take questions obviously at the end. One point that really leapt out at me there, if I may say, is your point there about people love responding to emergency, but they don't like preparing for emergencies. And I think we've seen that before. I without sort of going into which particular organisation it was. There was a big organisation I worked near at one point that almost measured its resilience by the size of its business continuity plan. And, well, there it is. That's our resilience. And, just trying to make this point that actually resilience was not about, it was not about actually making things tougher or harder. It was resilience, if you did it in the right way, if you were more adaptable, if you were more actively resilient, made you more agile. And actually for businesses, being more resilient was actually a better way for them to drive good business models as well. And this is something which we reflected back on, and actually being able to have that systemic understanding of how you deliver this and where you can have the impacts was really, really important. And I think you summarised that, if I may say so, really well, actually, Ellie. So thank you for that. We'll return to other questions at the end. Please do start to pull together questions, because I will open the floor a little bit later for particular cross-cutting questions. I am going to move on now to our second speaker this morning. And our second speaker is Dr. Renita Barden. Now, Renita is an architectural engineer and urban studies educator with a PhD in urban engineering. She directs the research group, Sustainable Designs Group at the University of Cambridge, where she works on data-driven intelligence of built environments and how they can effectively address sustainability goals and policies, as well as on climate heat stress and health in the built environment. So over to you, if I may.
Hello, everybody, and I'm very pleased to hear what Ellie said, because it's a very good transition to what I'm going to demonstrate. So I'm going to talk about mainly the UK context, but my major work is also in the Global South, and I work mainly on health, climate, and people, and in the intersection of it. So this is my research group. We broadly work on these four verticals of sustainable development goals. The colors give it all. And primarily what we are trying to do is we are trying to understand from a very data perspective, how can we inform policy? And when I say data, I'm not just talking about quantitative data, but I'm talking about storytelling. I'm talking about narratives that feed into a different stream of data, which Ellie was also emphasizing. It's so important for us to generate any sort of sustainable future, or even responding to emergency situations. And today I'm going to show how we work on these intersections. And as I said, I look at different sorts of social data, how people use a space, what's their perception, but also trying to understand their risks in terms of health. So this is my intersection of work, and definitely we are facing two great challenges, which is climate warming, and we need to reach the net zero target by 2050. How do we do this? What are the data layers that are required? What are the methodologies to intersect these data layers to get us to the results, and then finally interventions? So today I'm going to talk about how do we decarbonize the hard to decarbonize sector, or hard to treat sector, and also looking at resilience building through these narratives. So generally, we all know what is hard to decarbonize in UK. It's basically, there is lots of definition across. Typically, you're looking at if you cannot hard to retrofit, then it's very difficult. But then it's also heritage status, it's also off-grid. So there are lots of different challenges in order to identify first the hard to treat. Typically giving you a number, 25% of UK's housing is hard to decarbonize or hard to treat, which is an enormous number. And if I have to give you a number at where, in order to reach 2050 target, we should have started decarbonizing 2 buildings, nearly 1.6 buildings per minute, starting from 2022 January. So that's the statistics I'm going to leave you with. So, but then what is this whole argument? How do we identify which is hard to decarbonize? Not just from a very quantitative data, but also from a very people's perspective. So we started looking at this because we also wanted to respond to health, because if you are decarbonizing, it does have impacts to health, and the network shows very clearly how do we decarbonize. The more we do on the built environment part, the more it is going to impact health. So if you see, the 10% of excess winter deaths are directly attributable to fuel poverty, which is again connected to hard to decarbonization. So we started looking at defining identification of all these parameters into a common framework. And how does this work? We started looking at all these physics-based ground-up approach of looking at heat. How is heat trapped in urban spaces? And I was speaking to Jordan just before this, that this physics-based understanding of how heat is trapped in urban spaces. But also we have to look at what is the reality in terms of poverty, what are the crises people are looking. So we used lots of data. We also used a drone-based thermal imaging, which we are now in our second phase. We are launching a satellite. I'm collaborating with the Department of Astronomy. They're launching a satellite, and we are going to get much more detailed data and much more quicker data in terms of thermal imaging of buildings. So we don't need to do in-building audits every moment. So we combined all of them, and we started looking at, just from the heat signatures, can we distinguish which sort of area in Cambridge, so this is Cambridge, in Cambridge, which sort of area needs what sort of retrofit, and what are the priority areas? So we started looking at, so we found out 4 clusters effectively across the different residential typologies, from mid-terrace to end terrace and detached. And then we clustered to find out which cluster needs more retrofit. So just to give you an idea, if it is lower, that means it's need for lower retrofit, whereas if it's higher, like in cluster 1, mid-terrace type 2 is much more need of retrofit. So we have to prioritize that. And then identify different layers of hard to decarbonize. What we are doing this as, this was the first phase, what we are doing next is basically putting a layer on it, on what people think in terms of decarbonization, what people think in terms of retrofit, which area they want to get it retrofit, how much costing they have. So we are doing that, and then probably, unfortunately, I'm not going to show you that results now, but we came across different statistics that are enabling us to develop the questions that we are asking. What is the meaning of retrofit to people? What is the meaning of spending for retrofit to people? And that becomes much more critical question when we are asking for hard to retrofit. So we did find that tackling cold homes could save a significant amount of NHS budget. Of fuel switching can lead to decline of EPCs if they are incompatible system is selected, and smart meter installation typically results in an initial demand reduction, but it kind of fades away very soon. So looking at different technologies that are available, fabric first to heat pumps to a combination of fabric first and heat pumps, we found out that probably the combination works better, but transiting to heat pumps or air source heat pumps is a very difficult challenge. Moving across, we started, this is another project where we were looking at flood resilience. Flood is nothing new to people living in different parts of London. And so we said that there are lots of flood resilient maps. There are lots of physically generated geostatistical maps which tell us where the flood risk is. But the flood risk is felt by the people. So how do we connect the physical flood risk map to a much more people-centric map? So what we did, we just went into one of the, so this is in East London, we went into different social media and tried to find out the tags where people live in this sort of area, and has tagged different pictures to show what flooding looks like to them. So we had a quantitative fluvial flooding map, which is very easy to generate in current context, but there was also a very big, strong qualitative map, which told us where people marked that flooding actually affected their lives significantly. And that became much more important, because now we went into these areas, collected the narratives, and said, we gave them a plethora of choices which the councils are actually giving to make the area much more for flood mitigation, and trying to understand whether they like these different strategies that are being placed. And there are so much narratives built into it. So what we did was we combined this map with the qualitative flood map, along with, I'm showing just the social media, but we also have narratives from local people there, where we found out, we went into these areas, and then we combined these 2 maps to find out exactly where the priority area is. There are lots of people who have adopted and adapted to flood. That means they do not feel the risk of flooding the most as the areas which was highly dark, these sort of areas, because there isn't any avenue to escape the flooding when it happens there. So this sort of maps helps the government to make much more clearer decisions. And generally, it's a co-produced map, so it's always reflects the reality. Lastly, I'll just talk about why people become more important. So we asked a very big policy question: how do we place people at the center of emission reduction? And we know that building sector is the most hard to decarbonize sector. So let's look at what people think in terms of decarbonization. So we looked at 13 years worth of Twitter data and tried to answer a few questions. What are the characteristics of people-centric transition towards emission reduction in buildings? How has the discourse propagated over time? Like, what is the notion of climate crisis to people? There are lots of positive in terms of people think positively, and there's lots of misinformation that makes it look like climate change is a hoax, or it's only for the elite people, or it's only for people who have the time to think about it. So did it shape the environmental justice and the climate action question? Like, when certain climate events happen, what is the reaction? That's what we tracked for 13 years in Twitter data using machine learning and natural language processing. So there are 5 main findings. Our first finding was there was a very strong relationship. So if you look at these graph, this is the activity of Twitter across different COPs. So we started from COP15 in Copenhagen to COP26 in Glasgow. And because there was quite a large amount of publicity about COPs since the COP23, 24, people started reacting more. I understand we were aware that there is only a segment of population who express their opinion in Twitter, but that does mean there is also activity that increases quite rapidly during these sort of events. We did find there were more positive sentiments were more prominent and recurrent and have a larger share than the negative sentiments. But the diffusion of high-level climate policy discussions in the public domain shows that there is increased public engagement. So even if people think that it is more woke, it is only for a segment of population, there is a constant engagement towards these sort of topics. We wanted to see, was there a growth or higher rate of growth in terms of negative sentiments, because that's where misinformation becomes much more powerful. That's where greenwashing becomes much more powerful. So core topics being tweeted changed over time as new innovations or technologies are introduced. And so very recently, after COP26, during COP26, we found new words like carbon capture, mass timber. These were completely not there in the previous years. So there is new knowledge or new words that are becoming much more commonplace, much more public, and people are trying to understand it. Positive sentiments are more common within our sample set. However, post 2014, we did see nearly 30 to 40% rise in the negative sentiments. So this is a huge bracket of population who can be misled by greenwashing, who can be misled by misinformation, which can harm climate action significantly. So any new innovation in terms of climate action, if it is not propagated in the right words, if it is not propagated to the right platform, these can receive a lot more negative sentiments and feedback, which might actually hamper it being implemented or being successful. So looking at the people's understanding, we could understand that there is a need for climate action from a very people's perspective, and how do we capture that in a large scale data set. So I would have loved to show you the sentences that was said. So there's a lot of 4-letter words used while they are trying to explain their negative sentiment. But there is also a lot of conspiracy theories that are going on in the negative tweets. It's like Bill Gates is spending to control human population using climate change as a part of it, which these sort of conspiracy theories has lots of larger networks. And I don't know if I put the network, so I'll conclude my talk, but with few statements which I have come across throughout my work, is that in order to do very significant climate action, we need to first recognize the burden and create these multiple layers of data. And by data, I do not just mean physical data. It has to be the technical data. It also has to be the very social data. So mapping social value becomes very, very important. And we are probably doing that in not rigorously as we should be doing in our policy transition. So grounding all of these burden to interlink SDGs actually help countries who are trying to make progress in SDGs becomes much more prominent. Definitely, when we reflect, we have to have a people-centered approach. And then finally, to assure transferring the agency and generate new data. So over and over again, I've not shown that part here, but over and over again, we have found that there is a gendered agency. So there is a group of gender who understand that they have to take climate action, but they do not have agency or access to the right technology, do not have agency and access to the right information. So that generating that agency, the route to agency, is the critical link between people-centric approach. Then finally, built environment can be a climate action if done correctly. And if nothing else works, I think we should all pray. Thank you so much.
I tour de force actually in many senses in terms of the underpinning data that's necessary for us to start to build a better picture, everything from hard physics right the way through to sentiment analysis. The sentiment analysis, I know we touched on briefly before your presentation, is something which I am fascinated by, and how we decouple people's decisions on their day-to-day life from what may be misinformation, what may be decisions that they're taking based on other direction, is I think a real challenge. It's not something obviously we're just seeing in climate change. We've seen it. We saw it during COVID. We see it with many other aspects of life, and it's something which is increasingly growing. I remember a time, and this does date me a little bit, when the drink driving campaigns in the 1970s had a huge impact at changing public perception around something which was effectively embedded in everybody above a certain age. It was a done thing. And I mean, this sudden swing of the population away from supporting drink driving, when it became something which was really, you know, you're a social pariah if you drink drove. I start to see similar things starting to happen with climate change. So in a way, it's decoupling some of the negative impacts, but just this realization that actually it is time to change. It's a time to drive a new alignment. Be interesting to see how that scopes out and what some of the levers that we have to be able to decouple some of that going forwards. Thank you. We'll move on, if we may, to our final speaker this morning, and then we'll open up for some questions. Our final speaker is Professor Samir Bagain, who is Technical Director with the Environmental Planning Team at Arcadis, Professor of Planning and Resilient Systems at the University of Kent, and a councillor since 2019, but I think with a specialisation in town planning, of course. Associate Director of City Relationships with 100 Resilient Cities, pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation. Samir partnered with city leaders in Milan, Rome, Barcelona, Lisbon, Tbilisi, Amman and Ramallah to mobilise resources for resilience. So on the front line of delivery here. So over to you. Be interested to hear from you.
Thank you. Should I use this? Is it working? Oh, yeah. Okay. Shall we test it? Or is that you doing, not me? Oh, okay. Right. If we go back a sec. I did ask our, we have a lovely visualization team at Arcadis, and I said, just give me something that kind of highlights the urgency. And Max came up with this, which was interesting. It kind of mirrors, I think, the climate clock. I don't know if you saw the moment at the Climate Innovation Forum on the 28th, when His Majesty the King and the Mayor pressed the red button, and these clocks kind of were turned on everywhere. Don't know if they had one up in Scotland, but yeah. But again, it's the urgency is there. I think we all recognize that there is an urgency for climate action. But I think a lot of us would probably sit here and think, well, it's not happening. Why is it not happening, or why is it not happening quickly enough? Are there barriers? I mean, there clearly are barriers, and I think the barriers that exist come probably from different sectors. I mean, local government is an interesting one, because everybody believes that most local government has declared the climate emergency and they have targets to meet by 2030. Clearly unachievable. Clearly, and I think local government recognizes that they can't do that, because when they said that they wanted to be carbon neutral by 2030, they had no idea of the size of the ask and the magnitude and the costs and their ability to deliver. But it's there. I mean, it's there as a target, and it drives a lot of processes. But then politics and local government is an interesting one and an interesting story. If I start with this local government piece, so Brighton and Hove had the Green administration for the last 3 years. You'd think that's the right administration in order to combat, or lead at least on the climate action front. But the electorate thought no, and the Greens went down from 20 councillors on Brighton and Hove Council to 7, because they didn't listen, or so the electorate said. They did things that the Green Party thought was best, but they didn't take people with them. And we're now in a situation where we're having to reverse quite a lot of the actions that were taken, or pause them and go back and reconsider and rethink and actually do them better, as the current administration said, so that we are listening to what people want. So it's interesting, that kind of debate around what is possible, what is achievable, what is really important for climate action, but also what people think is right and credible and actually something that they buy into. But sometimes people will think, well, if you can't collect our rubbish, then we don't care, what you do for climate action, because it's all about basic services. And I think these tensions that live within local government probably hamper a lot of the efforts that both Ellie and Renita talked about, which is, why isn't local government delivering? Because I think we're probably asking too much of local government. And I think I'll say that, and then I'll come back to it, because I think it's important to then look at, within that systems play, what else is happening within that system, and what are the tools and levers and funding that is available for local government to deliver. Because everybody at the UN tells us that, for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, it's all about localizing the goals. Cities are where the action is. In the emergency response, urban refugees, suddenly became really, really important part of the play on the response to crisis, on the back of the Syrian refugee crisis, because most of the Syrian refugees went into cities, they didn't go into camps. And that immediately increased pressure on water, on schools, on hospital, on transport infrastructure, and so on. And that's that compounded, if you like, that systems pressures that one crisis in one particular place creates in another. But then local government, again, struggles to find the solution. So again, I'll leave you with that as a thought, because there's just a very interesting play there about where the action needs to happen and where the weaknesses are. Shall we move on to the next one, please? Globally, and again, it's interesting because this is the our play at Arcadis, and Arcadis is, as Jordan said, we are a design engineering consulting. We look after built and natural assets, and our core mission is to improve quality of life for people. So globalization, digitization, social expectation, and urbanization are really critical in terms of how we view the world. But these, again, they're not unique. I used to work for the Royal Institution for Chartered Surveyors. Granted, they've got their own problems, but their thought leadership team was interesting because they framed the global challenges, particularly on the training of future professionals, in these four themes. They looked at globalization, digitization, urbanization, and climate change. So again, the framing is there across a lot of these organizations that operate across, towns, cities, countries, work across organizations. So I think we can all take that as a given. We know that climate change is increasing in frequency in terms of the disasters and the earthquakes and everything else. And, nobody is saying that isn't happening. But I think the actual response on the ground is the interesting one. And I think that's the one that's worth unpacking. Can we jump to the next one, please? I don't need to hold that. In terms of buildings, and we've heard from Renita on the retrofit piece, particularly around heat pumps. I mean, I'm not a big fan of heat pumps, because as a town planner, there's probably something to be said about whether you can actually put the heat pumps at the front end of your property without planning permission. They are about that high and they are about that big. And if your building is not airtight, they are useless. They're not really doing what you want them to do, because you really need an airtight space. Your home needs to be airtight before they are effective in terms of what you want them, particularly as people switch from the standard energy systems. And that's the experience that people tell us. As a local councillor, I've got residents who switched, and the complaints are never ending. There are issues on that. However, we do have a problem. And the problem is probably something that you already know, which is that 80% of buildings that are with us today will be with us in 2050. So we really need to do something about those buildings. Now, what is the interesting one? But I think more importantly, how do we finance it? How do we pay for it? Okay, because the simple switch of, switching from your standard gas boiler to a heat pump, if you want to go for a heat pump, you're talking about tens of thousands of pounds. People are already getting sold hydrogen-ready boilers. But if you are offered one, do not take one. Because, the likelihood of hydrogen kind of heating our homes in the next 10 to 20 years is still, it's still, somewhere around there. We're certainly looking at hydrogen for transport. We're looking at hydrogen for decarbonizing maritime, so these things are certainly there, but definitely not for heating, definitely not for heating. I mean, you can't even transport hydrogen through the tunnels around London just because of the risks, so there are issues with that particular one. But again, it's not stopping people trying to sell hydrogen-ready boilers to households. But again, that's another matter. The retrofitting one is an interesting one, because as much as local government supports retrofits, and I say this as a town planner, as somebody who teaches planning, we do not have the planning policies in a few places, in quite a number of places, that allow us to retrofit to net zero standards. So the policies that are in place do not mandate net zero retrofits. People will get away with whatever they can get away with. And if the policy doesn't necessarily specifically say, and be very explicit, saying when you retrofit a property, when you're converting a house in multiple occupation, when you're looking at a heritage listed building, you have to do the retrofit to a net zero standard. If the policy doesn't say that, it does not happen. Okay, and that's one of the problems why we're not getting an accelerated rate of retrofits. The other one is the skills. I mean, we know that brickies are very hard to get hold of. There's something to be said about the skilled labor, but that's happening across multiple sectors. We're working on a project supporting the arts and culture in the Thames estuary, from London all the way out to Thanet and Thurrock on both sides of the River Thames. And there's no electrical engineers, there's no theatre producers, there's no technician operating lighting equipment. So that skills issue is actually a lot more ingrained, I think, than any of us would like to admit. And the sustainable design piece kind of comes on the back of that, because the tools that are there are still very local. So we have the London Energy Transformation Initiative, LETI, which has published a net zero design guide that was published well before the pandemic in 2019. They've got a net zero tool. So all of the tools are there. But I think what's missing is that ability to mainstream a lot of that work. The Mayor of London has a lot of local plan guidance and policies that kind of push in the same direction. They push on urban design, they push on design quality, they push on viability. But again, when you're the mayor of London, you can have policies, but when you have 33 boroughs that each one of them needs to buy into your policies, it becomes a very difficult one, because again, there's no mandating of action there. Can we jump to the next one, please? Which then takes us into, I think, something very similar to some of the things that both Renita and Ellie talked about, which is, where does the innovation come from? Especially that we have, as we see here, we've got a polycrisis. And by polycrisis, this is where it's really useful to understand the systems piece. When you have a refugee crisis, a lot of those refugees move in to live in cities, not in camps. We're very good at doing the response for managing migration into camps, particularly if it's an earthquake or internal displacement or a civil war. But actually, when we look at what's happening at school places, particularly when we think about urban refugees, transport systems, the pressures that transport systems are under. Yeah. Oh, Jordan said we can talk as much as we like. Yeah, no, it's fine. So I am elaborating more than I wanted to. But if we go back to the definition of resilience, which, I mean, there are so many, and Jordan gave one at the start. The one that I like, which again, not because I worked for the Rockefeller Foundation, but because it kind of breaks down the layers in the system. It's the ability of individuals, communities, governments, and systems to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what acute shocks and chronic stresses come their way. And it's that distinction between the acute shocks, the earthquakes, the flooding, and the response to it, and then the chronic stresses, the air pollution, which we know now kills people in London, the transport congestion, and the ultra-low emission zone expansion, which is currently sitting in the courts. Tells you a little bit about that tension between what is good for people, what is good for climate, but also what is not good for business, which is where a lot of that tension is coming from. And understanding those layers in the system is really, really critical. Local resilience forums, for example, and again, might be worth touching on them in the discussion. They're there for a purpose. They're set up under the Civil Contingencies Act. But there are a lot of people, even in the revised local resilience forums, when the Civil Contingencies Act, I think it was revisited, was it last year or the year before, they still don't have the right people sitting around the table, which is why currently, especially when you look at the house building crisis and why we're not building houses, you have the Environment Agency and Natural England attacking each other, even though both are implementing government policies, because they're each blaming each other. So there are these little glitches, if you like, within the broader system that aren't really, really helping. And I like this from the World Economic Forum. I mean, bless them, they're lovely, the team at the WEF, aren't they? It's when you look at a 10-year spread, you could see more and more of the climate risks kind of creeping into their listing of climate crisis. They didn't have pandemic until 2021. It kind of got missed for a few years. But what's interesting this year is they moved away from this and said, we need to look at that. And actually, that's exactly what we need to look at. Because, and the Local Resilience Forum and the response to flooding is an interesting one. A lot of agencies come in to help people when flooding happens. But the flooding doesn't end when the water subsides, because sometimes it takes people 3 or 4 years before they can move back into their neighborhoods. Once they get through the insurance, once they get through the buildings, sometimes they need to rebuild entirely. And actually, it's not that crisis itself. It's not the physical infrastructure. It's the social, it's the emotional resilience piece, which kind of takes, it looks like long COVID because it goes on and on and on. And I think just understanding that as policymakers is absolutely critical, which is why, again, in the work we're doing at the University of Kent, we teach organizational resilience, we teach digital resilience, we teach economic resilience, we teach emotional resilience, and we teach urban resilience, side by side, because absolutely critical to understand these. If we move on, please. Just 2 final points. Net zero is technical. I mean, we saw that in the data from Renita. totally get that, you know, but as somebody who studied architecture, planning, urban design, I'm kind of more in that space. Placemaking is one of those really fuzzy things, but they're absolutely critical to delivering net zero, particularly when we look at biodiversity net gain and a lot of the stuff that we need to do in urban landscape as we move away from, you know, the kind of hard surface that we're looking at outside. That's absolutely critical, particularly for adaptation, as was highlighted recently by, I think, the Climate Change Committee's latest reporting last month. If we move to the next one. And these are the things, again, that really important where that targeted action is. Regulations, do we have the right regulations placed? Back to planning policies, supply chains. So you've got the scope 3 emissions piece within your supply chain, whether you're doing enough as an organization, are you doing enough? But there's another piece here that looks at skills within supply chains. It looks at diversity within supply chains, and it looks at resilience within supply chains, because there's no point in having a supply chain with low emissions that isn't resilient. But again, it's how much do you spend on that? And then adaptation. And Ellie and I were talking about the National Adaptation Plan, which was published this morning. The initial responses are it's not in the right place, but it's, you know, it's what else would you expect? Because the National Resilience Framework had the right aspirations, but again, it wasn't necessarily in the right place. Next one, please. And I think, yeah, just leave you with that, the adaptation gap, because that was particularly singled out by the Climate Change Committee. They said, we're not doing enough on adaptation. We had the high-level climate champions meet at PwC a couple of weeks ago, and they said, we're not doing enough for adaptation. So adaptation meaning, you know, the mitigation, but also the building of the climate resilience. But I think underlying that is the thing about skills, it's the thing about regulations, it's the thing about supply chains, and everything else that you need. So it's not as simple as, you know, clicking your fingers and it will happen, because it will not happen, particularly given where I started, the tensions in local government. Actually, I mean, it actually is very difficult to build adaptation within local government. And I think the next one is the last one. You know, it's back to our clock, you know, do we do this or do we just action? But again, the action piece is very difficult. I don't know what it would look like, but hopefully we can have a conversation about that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. Can I ask our speakers to just come and join us at the front, and we'll start off with questions. But the first observation I'm just going to make. I mean, my background, I'm a particle physicist originally, so you know I was schooled in the world of build a simulation of something, measure the real world, compare the difference, and that's physics. That's the new physics. And I got really interested in the world of digital twins as a result, and I like the idea of a model. And I became the Deputy CSA for transport for the UK, Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor for transport for the UK for a number of years. And I thought this is going to be easy in a way, because this is just about modelling. You know, we build models of things and then we can understand. What I actually realised at that point was that this, you know, transport was hugely driven by stakeholders. Everybody was a stakeholder. Everybody had a view of transport. It worked at multiple levels. It was deeply complex. The technology is actually quite easy. The hearts and minds, the social side of it was really quite complicated. And that actually, for me, was one of my biggest learning points, is realization that the policy side of this, the need to have interventions which are led by individuals socially at multiple levels, that's where the complexity sat. And I think, you know, your talk, if I may, Samir, really brought that out for me. And that's going to actually frame my first question to all three of you, actually. This is a game of multiple stakeholders, and it's a game of multiple tensions as well amongst stakeholders. Data is clearly really important to helping drive some of that, but equally, how do we get into a world where we can start to align stakeholders and timescales together? And I mean, that's the big question I know, and we're not going to crack it this morning, but I'd be interested in your views on that as perhaps an opening question. Perhaps, I don't know, would you like to go? Would you like to go first? Sorry to drop you.
It's this mic, it's fine, right? I strongly feel, because we have been working with multiple stakeholders, involving identifying the critical stakeholders becomes the first step. And we often miss that step, and we often probably cannot identify that. So that's the critical step in. And I also, from my perspective, I also consider that as a data. What is the landscape of stakeholders? Who are the people who will be critically affected by a particular action or a particular intervention that is being proposed? So finding that itself needs much more capacity building in both academia, in policy, in industry. Secondly, a lot more initiatives where the industry, think tanks, and academia can work together and co-produce. So the key word for me would be co-production rather than advocacy, which for a long time we have been doing. So primarily these two areas become very important, and once we can build a capacity on that, we will probably be able to go down to the grassroots level where actual stakeholders get impacted most. So generating these different information layers and concerns of different stakeholders become very important.
Interested by the co-production point. Co-creation, co-production is something I'm very interested in. And Mariana Mazzucato's work as well, I think, in that space has been particularly interesting.
Yes, so I think in response to that question about the state, who should be involving in stakeholders, my response to that would be questioning and exploring and challenging whose voice has been heard to date and the motivation behind involving those stakeholders. Because what we've seen in the UK in terms of climate adaptation, for the past few decades, there was this lack of inertia and lack of progress from national level government. And because of that, cities stepped in. And these are widely praised. There's a myriad of initiatives. We've heard of Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities. There's C40, Covenant of Mayors. And yes, it's true, we have seen, fantastic levels of ambition from some urban areas, but we have to take a step back and see, well, why are those cities interested? And often they're interested in the risk to their fiscal assets. And if we're looking at who's around the table, often it's chambers of commerce, business owners, and rightly so, they should be there. But that then takes this economic focus. And I think what we're seeing is, in the words of Linda Shee, who's done some amazing research in New York and metropolitan area, is that we're seeing acts of omissioning and acts of commissioning in terms of climate adaptation, where you're omitting the people whose voices are being impacted by climate incidences, and you're commissioning adaptation interventions in areas that do have wealthier populations, leading to gentrification and the climate resilience of people who are able to have the time and the capacity to make their voices heard at these town halls. So I think we need to be looking at the historic decisions and processes and ensuring those aren't replicated to lead to further inequities. And also I endorse the idea of co-creation, but I would question how much is actually being co-created, or are we actually just engaging stakeholders and ticking the box, and that's really tokenistic and sets us back.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask one more question, if I may, and then I'll open up the floor. Does that work with your timing, Jack? In which case, I will open up the floor. So who would like to ask the first question? Adam.
Hi, thank you all for the excellent presentations. Touching on the first presentation by you, Ellie, and the last presentation by you, Samir, there's this discussion around sort of accountability and certainly with you, Samir, the discussion around green initiatives not having public support. One of the things I've seen in the past is that you do transport assessments and you get like 80% of people responding saying, yeah, we must have better, greener initiatives, things like that. And yet when local, low traffic neighbourhoods were brought in, you had like 80% saying cars must have priority over anyone else on the roads. How do you deal with that level of discourse? And also, sorry for you, Ellie, just to sort of clarify a little bit more. You were talking about sort of accountability within government departments, and this has impact on all government departments, which in my experience then means they all then try and shift the blame onto, or sorry, not blame, shift the responsibility onto other areas of the government. How do you break down that sort of siloed nature? So I think for you, Samir, it's that how do you deal with it on a local level? And for you, Ellie, how do you perceive that that should be done on the government level?
So it's quite timely in terms of that accountability question, because as was mentioned, the National Adaptation Plan was launched today. We did get a leak of it yesterday, and The Guardian widely reported on its lack of ambition. Having a quick skim of it this morning before today's presentation, I did see one of their commitments was to setting up a panel of climate resilience managers cross-government. So we'll see if that speaks to the root of the problem which you mentioned. But I think, again, it comes down to resourcing, in that there's, again, initiatives that we could be adopting from cities in terms of climate budget tracking to actually hold people to account, to say, okay, if you've committed this, let's see the receipts. Are you actually doing this? But again, I think it can't just be government. And also, we should be I think there's lastly, just an important point, to not just look at DEFRA and the National Adaptation Plan, but also learn from our devolved nations, which in many cases are more progressive. So we hope to see the forthcoming Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme next year. And fingers crossed, it has some more ambition and accountability and systemic adaptation than what we're seeing coming through the NAP.
I mean, on that particular point, I think if there is a cross-cutting cross-cutting theme across government departments and the verticals, it would be really interesting, because I'll give you an example. So BEIS, the old BEIS, had been doing the district heating pilots for a number of years, and DLUC had no idea this was happening. But again, and this is the government department that's meant to create policy in order to help local authorities deliver, and then local authorities were delivering district heatings with the help of another government department. So again, if we can get over that, then that would be lovely. LTNs, and I mentioned the ULEZ, but LTNs is, again, one of those things which is really interesting, and LTNs, let's include school streets in that, because again, they're slightly different, but they're certainly part of the package of that active travel funding that came from the DFT, on the back of COVID. And granted, when the funding came in 2020, local government had to react very quickly. So a lot of them put closed street, created cycle lanes, probably in places maybe they shouldn't have. But again, there was minimal consultation. And they went through, it's interesting when you look at the instruments that made these happen, so went through under what's called emergency traffic regulation orders, which then had to go back through a full cycle of approvals in order to become permanent traffic regulations order. And when you went through that process, it kind of unpacked a lot of the discontent in terms of, why they were there and whether they were being used. And even the cycling lobby said, well, welcome the opportunity for more cycle lanes and active travel, but these things are in the wrong place, so there's that level. But LTNs, and particularly school seats, and there's something in between, which is neither an LTN nor a school street, but it's something that creates a safer street, it's part of a safer street package. So we've got one of those on the Brighton side of Brighton and Hove, and it came in under a 6 months emergency traffic regulation order, to create a one-way system around schools. And the school's happy with it, which is fine. But the school is talking to the parents, but the school isn't talking to anybody else, definitely not talking to the neighbors. That made the neighbors unhappy. So the neighbors started their own campaign, and what you ended up with the neighbors being pitted against school, with neighbors trying to reverse a one-way system and school and parents trying to keep a one-way system. Now, that's not helpful to anybody, but that's how these things actually work and how they work in practice. And we've had examples of school streets where you ended up with a closure with bollards at the end of a street. They were taken out, challenged, then put back, then taken out again. So I think that still is in the realm of, whichever way a council leadership kind of leans, it pushes within a particular direction. We've now got, because we had a new administration come in after the May elections, And we had approved a cycle lane across the seafront that goes further west than our current one. But then the administration came back 2 weeks ago and said, we're putting a halt to it. It's going to cost us a bit of money because to stop the contractor, because the contractor should have started 2 days ago or 2 days before. We're going to create a bi-directional one because that's what the LTN, is it 120 or LTN 20? You know, the cycling guidance from the DFT. I think it's LTN 120. Because that's what it says. Bi-directional cycle lanes are better than unidirectional cycle lanes. But if we did that, it will cost us substantially more. But we will consult. And we said, but we've consulted and it's agreed and everything else. So it's funny how these things do end up becoming more of a political football, if you like, because for a local authority to say these things will cost us more when there's no money in the system, where they're saying we're already 10 million underspend in this financial year, just doesn't make sense. But again, this is the sort of conversations that are going on in local government, you know, and they're probably not helpful to you kind of looking at the overall metrics and the disclosures you do to the Carbon Disclosure Project and others, for example.
Benita, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
But I think to respond to the question of silos, we, in our Cambridge thermal imaging process, we did the whole of Cambridge Council, as well as various other private landowners were also involved. So that's where the local government was very, very helpful to us in the sense getting the consent, getting people to be excited about. And I just showed you a part of it. It was not just thermal imaging from drones, but we were also going in some representative apartments to do thermal U value monitoring and all of that so that we can build it up into a model and scale it up. And we have to do it after dark. So we were in houses of people at 10 o'clock at night, probably when people are supposed to be sleeping. We left the site around 12:30, I remember. And but there was so much enthusiasm from the people in participating. They actually asked, we chose one wall. They asked us, can you also do this wall? Because I just retrofitted that. And making this data much more visible, excuse me, making this data much more visible was actually, thank you, Jordan, made a lot more impact. So when we release the results and we actually send it back to the council so that they can reflect on it, they can also share it with the people who agreed to open their doors at VRs for us. We received a lot more positive comments. So this probably the push from the people actually helps the government direct their priorities and then say, okay, but I hear you that when there is this economic budgeting, then these stakeholders become probably the secondary people, and it becomes primarily about, do we have the money to do it and the budget to do it? But probably it's not always the money part, it's always identifying who needs most and where the willingness is. So with the right form of information, I know even with the right form of information, it can be misdirected, but still that effort towards that direction would be important.
I think the answer is relatively funny, but we might just squeeze one more in.
Sure. Like I just combine like my two sub questions. My first, the first part of the question is about the skills. You mentioned quite a few times that there need to be a lot of uplift of skills on the research analysis of this area. I'm just wondering like how this has been evolving, or whether there will be lots of challenges like to conquer at this stage. And my second part for my question is that we didn't really touch on about the financial part quite a bit, but I see it is really big blockage. If the finance cannot be like, we cannot make it break even, it will be hard to to implement any ideas. And we didn't really touch on about investors as well. I'm just wondering whether we can get some positive pressure from the investors' perspective to really move it forward. Thank you.
I mean, on the finance one, I think fiscal devolution for local government is probably a good thing. I think everybody's warming to it. There are, Ellie mentioned C40 and Global Covenant of Mayors, and they do open global funds to cities. And Glasgow, with under Susan Aitken, for example, has kind of done a lot with that. It's probably not immediately visible, and she's somebody that sits with a one-seat majority, so it could all kind of flip very quickly. Climate bonds, certainly if you listen to Sean Kidney, talking about climate bonds and the super uptake for climate bonds, you'd think that's going to solve world problems, but we're still not seeing it in cities as much as we can. And on the skills front, I think there's a lot to be said about what we're teaching the professionals as they kind of come through the system, whether that's architects, surveyors, engineers, planners, and so on. I think the professional bodies work together, and they work together with national associations, but also, so Commonwealth Association for Architects, Commonwealth Association for Planners. So there's a lot of traction, but I don't know whether it's cascading into the right places yet.
Much knowledgeable about the area about how local governments can be funded. Yes. So it's I think one part which I feel, especially when you're talking about the schools part, what I have found it much more relevant is investing on not just financial investing on giving time to people and making them understand what a certain intervention means to them, and what are the basic skill sets required. Making it much more clearer becomes much more transparent. So it's actually relates to accountability and transparency in a system, and it's across stakeholders. And even if we are changing the environmental curriculum for the schools, at least the A levels, and we are at that verge. So we were discussing, because we are part of that discussion, what should the new curriculum involve, and these identifying very critically the skill sets that our future generation needs is very important, and that's not very clear currently. We still look at very classical skill sets.
Yeah. Very true.
Yeah.
There's some work I was doing talking about a much more cross-cutting skill set. So how we do a T-shaped people, I'm still not sure that at the moment.
Yeah, a very valid question about looking at reducing barriers to investment. And I think one way which we should be doing this is the public sector de-risking this investment in order to show that adaptation can have a return on investment and that is feasible. And I think there's some innovative projects that are doing this. So, for example, I think it's DEFRA have our Natural Environment Restoration Fund. In Scotland, there's a Scottish Marine Environment Fund. And they are looking at things such as, managed realignment, coastal adaptation, which you might not think has an adaptation dividend, but there's innovative ways that you can look at it in terms of blue carbon credits, but also tourism revenue, to show that there are the triple dividend of adaptation of both reduced damages, but also social and environmental returns on investment. Yeah.
She mentioned very recently, it's not yet implemented here. Very recently in the Global South, there was a heat insurance policy that was initiated for people who lose a lot of working days due to heat. And that has become quite an important insurance policy, especially among women who go out to work. And because they do lose quite a significant amount of their subsistence because of these extreme events. So this was very innovative, and it basically translates to making clear what the risks are. So when people understand and internalize the risk, that becomes much more. Then that can be converted to an instrument. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm the field lead of Humanities and Social Sciences at Imperial, and I was really pleased that all four of you are making my case for me. So I was just, we're talking about skills, just building directly on the last question. I'm just intrigued by how your advocacy work, public engagement, how these audiences receive this message that you're passing on. Thank you.
we were doing a project on what does heat mean to people, and to people across different countries who have acclimatization to heat, have a long thermal history. Also, people who do not have any acclimatization to heat. And then what we did was we collected so many narratives in terms of what does heat mean to them, and when does it become a burden. But we didn't end there. We also asked them, what would you do if you were to design something or an intervention for your own benefit? And then we thought probably people will say things which are repeated lots of times. We wouldn't come up with anything innovation. But what we found out that based on the context, based on the culture, these differences, the differences of interventions became much more distinct. And when we released it, so we converted this into an animation, and then we showed it to on an open festival. And the response that we got was, this is so interesting. Can we get more data on this? How do we? And these are people, local people. These are also people who are specialists in different fields. But a very short animation film, which actually narrates the whole story of different meaning of heat across, was so powerful that we also didn't expect that. And when most of them came back and asked us, we were very interested in the layers of interventions that came from different parts of the world. People who were accustomed to heat had a culture of managing with heat. So there's lots of lessons to be learned from that part of responding to heat, and for people who have never faced these extreme heat. So there is a lot of maladaptation. So they don't think that this heat can kill them, or there is a need for intervention, or some people are more proactive in taking higher protection. But so so I felt that when we did the public engagement, it became much more impactful. So converting it into public knowledge becomes much more powerful for any climate action, and making it much more simpler, which often we don't do it.
Still scribbling away notes there. So yeah, I think it's been interesting in this role, seeing our advocacy and then public engagement work. And as I said, we've done a substantial research in terms of our polling to understand what the national level assessment is. And through my role, I've been engaging with staff and volunteers. So I'll just speak from my perspective in that way. And what I've been surprised is the real polarization, and that climate change is unfortunately seen as a woke issue. And I think from our perspective, that needs to be addressed. And what we're trying to do that is through three ways. Firstly, to make it practical. So that's why we've been speaking about, well, how we've been affected by weather and climate impacts to date, rather than this, future far off thing. And secondly, to relate it to things that matter to them, because again, it's a problem for someone else. But well, how actually does increasing tick relate to your hiking holiday in the Highlands? How does drought and water band shortages affect your Grand's garden? And then thirdly, to frame it in a positive, action-orientated way, because again, our research shows that doom and gloom perspective doesn't actually work, which surprises me from an Irish Catholic perspective. But really, as Susan Moser says, to really adopt that grounded hope, in that being very honest about the consequences of climate change, but that it's still all to play for in terms of the adaptive capacity we can help communities develop and grow. And that's what we hope to do over the coming years with partners such as Imperial. We'd love to discuss more.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I think there's things happening at different levels, or probably more precisely not happening. So I've been a school governor for 14 years, and I've seen BTECs disappear, through particularly in those areas where, and in particular communities and geographies where they are needed. A GCSE in the built environment has been on the table for a number of years. I think last year the Lords kind of put in a recommendation to government to push ahead with it, but that hasn't happened. But there's a lot of professional bodies kind of pushing behind the scenes on that. I did a first degree at the Bartlett at UCL in architecture, building planning, and environmental studies. Those kind of combined degrees don't exist anymore, because we had really a cross-cutting curriculum, which probably doesn't suit the way schools are organized in higher education institution these days. But a few years back, that was really, really good. And then it allows you to kind of dip into architecture, planning, construction, you know, and the environmental study side. So I think there's something to be said, both at schools, GCSEs, schools, BTECs, and then on through to higher education, and particularly a push from professional bodies, which I think is happening, but they're probably not getting the sort of traction they get. And there is a coalition of professional bodies continuously pushing in that direction.
Thank you very much. Look, I'm going to draw the proceedings to a close. Lunch is available, I believe, next door. Before we finish, firstly, can I just thank Jack and Max at the Institute for making sure this all runs smoothly today, but in particular to our speakers this morning. If I can ask you just to thank them in a traditional manner for their talks this morning. I wish I could invite people online to join us next door. I understand there's probably quite a bit of lunch there, but thank you everybody for coming this morning. I hope you also attend future ISST events. First one I've been to, really enjoyed it. Thank you, Jack.